Joined here on Next, in person, finally in person, Pam Anderson, former Jeffco clerk, one of the Republican candidates for Colorado Secretary of State. She's in a three-way primary race with Mesa County Clerk Tina Peters and business consultant Mike O'Donnell. They have both also been invited to join us here. Pam Anderson, welcome back to Next.
Oh, thank you for having me, and it is great to be here in person.
Back in studio. This is our first in-studio political interview in some time.
I feel very honored.
So let me ask, you are in a Republican primary for an office to run elections, oversee elections, when polls show that a majority of Republican voters falsely believe that elections are rigged. You do not promote that false claim. Should those Republicans even consider voting for you?
Absolutely, and I don't believe that most Republicans believe that. I actually think I have faith in the voters, both for the June primary and going on into November. What I know as a former election official, as a former Jefferson County clerk and recorder, and a municipal clerk, that we built a system that you don't have to say, hey, we're your government, trust us. We have verifiable elections here in Colorado. And so we vote on a paper ballot. We have robust post-election audits. And I'm the candidate with a professional background and experience to be able to communicate to those people of good conscience that have questions about how we do elections in Colorado and answer those questions.
We certainly know that polling can be wrong, but time and again polls have shown that Republican voters, at least on a nationwide level, believe the big lie about elections, and it's not really close. Do you think something different is going on in Colorado? Do you think there's been a recent sea change?
Well, my experience over the last 20 years in improving our elections here in Colorado, as the county clerk, I was also president of the Clerks Association in 2013, where we said, you know, when I was elected, I had some of the same questions. How do we know the outcome is correct? How do we know the calculator works right? Paper ballots, really important. Building that verifiability makes sure there's transparency. I supported ballots being public while protecting voter privacy. Ensuring that those sorts of improvements continue is why I'm running.
There was a time when you would hear Republicans and Democrats talk about Colorado's elections being the gold standard. And now you hear things like what one of your primary opponents, Mike O'Donnell, is saying is there is no interest in election integrity in Colorado. Is there interest in election integrity, and what gives you such faith in our current processes?
I think that diminishes the work that local election officials have done over the last decade. I'm the only candidate in this race with a real record of voter integrity and making sure that we have secure and accessible elections. What do I mean by that? I supported paper ballots to make sure the calculator can be verified. I supported more transparency, that those paper ballots are public and that you can independently verify it. I supported audits. I received an award from the National Associations of Secretaries of State for my work on post-election audits. But we can always do more. I don't know any competent professional election officials that says we're done. There are best practices that we can institute. For example, I developed a signature verification quality assurance audit that we can take statewide. It's a best practice, but we need to be consistent about it. Another thing is our voter list can always be improved. But this job is about leadership, not just looking at a spreadsheet. If you see something, report it, and then we do this within the law. And that's what's very important for verifiability.
I think that's one thing that we hear a lot from people, whether they're looking at the voter rolls and they're saying, you know, there are names on these rolls that shouldn't be there, or if they're looking at voting systems and they're saying, here's a potential vulnerability. What we rarely hear is the linkage to say, and then now here's the fraud. Have you gone looking for the election fraud that your opponents claim exists, personally?
Personally and professionally, local election officials and as a county clerk, we report incidences of voter fraud, which happen in every election. It is rare, but that's our obligation. And then law enforcement is responsible for investigating that and determining the intent. Most often voters are not well informed, they're not sure they shouldn't have signed their spouse's ballot. Those get rejected through robust voter verification, which we have here in our state. But making sure that we're auditing that process, we're checking it as we go, that's been my job. I train and educate local election officials. I was brought to different states to advise on how to improve their elections process. As Secretary of State, I will continue that work.
Your other primary opponent Tina Peters is facing felony charges for allegedly tampering with voting systems, and she's accused Democratic Secretary of State Jenna Griswold of treason, which is a federal crime punishable by execution. So I suppose we should get you on the record with this. If elected, will you seek the imprisonment or execution of your Democratic predecessor?
Oh, my goodness. So the Secretary of State's office is not law enforcement, nor is it the courts. People deserve their due process. But what I can tell you is I'm the only candidate in the race that's running to not be hyper-partisan and use this as a political partisan office or a weapon against any political enemies. Our system protects voters regardless of their background, regardless of their political persuasion. What we need is a professional in this office that will set aside hyper-partisan rhetoric and bring it back to a trusted and fair referee of the process.
Do you see anything to suggest that for all your criticism of Democratic Secretary of State Jenna Griswold, that she has behaved in a way that would encourage or abet fraud or anything like that in the process?
One of the reasons I'm running, Kyle, is I saw a disturbing trend both with the Secretary's office and a few of our local election officials to being hyper-partisan and political and really trying to just elevate their political profile.
I want to talk about that, but I'd like to put that in one pile and then put doing things that are illegal in another pile, because your opponents accuse the current Secretary of State of illegal behavior. Have you seen anything like that?
I have not observed that, but I have observed Jenna Griswold putting her thumb on the scales in the regulatory environment. I believe this is a profession, and there are ethics that go with this, and being a partisan, hyper-partisan actor and using the power of the office to penalize your political enemies is not something what we need. We need to return this office back to the tradition of professionalism and training and a fair referee.
In the regulatory process, the Secretary of State certainly can have a voice in terms of how elections should be run. Where do you think that Secretary Griswold has overstepped in a partisan way when it comes to the regulatory environment? Yeah.
I have experienced and seen up close where she's used the power of her office or her political cronies to reach out and impact the office of county clerks, as well as people trying to participate in the political process, like through the initiative process. Sending campaign finance penalties for candidates, only unaffiliated candidates, because they may impact Democratic outcomes. Tripling a penalty from an administrative law judge for certain access to the political process. I think having that influence and seeing a difference between her social media on the political side and what the office is saying gives people the absolute right impression that she can't be fair and that she is being hyper-partisan.
Let's talk about that, because certainly Secretary of State Griswold has been a partisan Democrat while in office. Different than her Republican predecessor, Wayne Williams, who tried to distance himself from some of that partisanship. But not all that much different, honestly, than Republican Scott Gessler, who preceded him, who was a very active partisan Republican when he was in office. What course would you chart for yourself? What would be off limits while you're Secretary of State?
Well, I think you can look at my proven record as a county clerk. For example, I will not do any sort of political endorsements as an election official. I will not take policy stands on things that will likely come forward as an initiative to go before the voters. I think I was a softball umpire, a baseball umpire in college. I know how this works. I know that voters begin to suspect whether or not the process is fair, and that's what undercuts it. I wouldn't forward an investigation appropriately to law enforcement and then fundraise off of it while the investigation is going through, like my opponent, Jenna Griswold, does.
You're talking about the Tina Peters case. She
Yes.
fundraises quite actively off the Tina Peters case, and she was involved in the referral to law enforcement.
I think there are bright lines from a professional ethical perspective. I think Coloradans expect more for this office than political partisan behavior.
Weighing in, though, on things like legislation that affect how elections run, I imagine you would not have an issue doing that.
I think weighing in on policies that affect voters and affect the business community as it operates under the Secretary of State's office is very appropriate. I engaged at the legislature as a county clerk. I was a legislative co-chair, bipartisan teams, and we advocated for voters for the business community, for the customer service that we provided as county clerks, that's very appropriate.
What do you think of the bipartisan election security measure that's going through the state legislature? It's been changed a bit since it was introduced. It could be changed some more still, but as it stands today, would you support that?
So when it was introduced, I strongly opposed it. It has been amended. I do believe it needs further amendment, and here's why. I support what the county clerks are trying to do to increase the penalty on security issues for bad actors. I think that's really important. I support training and education for local election officials and the security protocols in there. What I oppose is making sure, Jenna Griswold is making sure that it doesn't apply to her as the secretary. I disagree with that. I'm the only certified election official in the race. I will continue the training and expertise that I have. This is a rapidly changing environment. What's good for the state election official and local election official should be consistent.
Any other issue with that bill as it stands other than how the certification and education requirements impact the Secretary of State?
So initially it had a lot to do with the First Amendment and who gets to decide who's violating the First Amendment and whose opinion matters more. I have real problems, and there is a little bit of a piece still left in there, and I'm wondering who the arbiter is of that standard. I think that can be a very slippery slope in our political process.
That was an idea that was in the original bill about penalties for misinformation about elections and things like that, and it was largely stripped out.
Largely. There's still some conversation about mis and disinformation, and I think, determining whose truth is the truth. I prefer independent citizen verifiability as determining the truth.
You're Republican. Republicans have had a difficult time winning statewide office in recent years, despite the fact that in the office of Secretary of State, Republicans have held that office far more times than Democrats have. So there's a potential that if you were to be elected Secretary of State, you might be the only statewide elected Republican. And yet you're forswearing partisan politics while in office. Is that going to jive? Is there going to be too much party pressure for you to take if you become the, a statewide elected Republican?
So those that have known me, those I've represented in Jeffco and as the executive director for the state, know that I don't speak for political, partisan, or political advantage. I have stood up to my own party when I believe they've been wrong. For the voters, for access and security. It is a very polarizing environment. What I know is any Democrat or Republican candidate need more than Democrats and Republicans to vote for them here in Colorado. And I won Jefferson County twice, the most politically diverse county in the state at the time, and which also reflects what Colorado is. I think Coloradans and the voters have told me they want a professional. They want to restore that professionalism and that fair referee and get away from the polarizing partisan politics. That does not mean that I don't fight for voters, for the integrity of the process, for securing elections and making sure they're transparent. I've built my career on that, as well as my husband and I are business owners. There's a whole section of that job. It's about leadership. Not high turnover of that office, making sure we're serving the citizens at the front lines. That's been my record, and as secretary, I will continue that.
The last two Republican secretaries of state were both challenged on whether their personal business interests interfered with their state business. Any such concerns if you're elected?
So my business, my husband and I have a die-cast business and a powder coat business. So I don't think
kind of business, huh?
But I am also an elections consultant. I actually do I contracted in leadership, and I have a master's in public administration. So my consulting business means jurisdictions, municipalities, states. Bring me in to advise them on how to improve the process, how to become more efficient. What are the best practices in elections? If elected Secretary of State, there would not be a conflict because I would suspend that.
Okay, you'd hold off on that elections-related work. So obviously so much of this race and the political conversation has fixated around false election rigging claims. Obviously there's other business the Secretary of State's office does. You alluded to that. Yeah. Do you see efficiencies or changes that you would like to make as they relates to business and charity licensure and things like that that nobody else in the office has done yet?
Yeah, so I have a record as Jefferson County Clerk and Recorder. I led that that office during one of the most difficult financial crises since the Great Depression. While doing that, we were able to become more efficient, do more remote services. We were able to reduce our salary impact by having a smaller team, but that became more productive because of the technology we were able to offer citizens. I don't believe that this is an office where we should waste taxpayer money. I would be an efficient user of the taxpayers' funds, as I did as the county clerk, and I wouldn't be wasting half of the COVID money to make commercials for myself as a politician, and trust the team that is there and recruit the best and brightest to me like I did when I was county clerk.
I want to ask you about that idea of using taxpayer money to make self-promotional commercials. We saw the Secretary of State Griswold do that. We've also seen Republicans in statewide office do that, particularly in the Treasurer's office. Mm-hmm. So is that just like a no, like you will not appear in voter education campaigns and that kind of thing, or what would be your ground rules on that?
I believe the most effective secretaries in the past, like Wayne Williams, like Donetta Davidson, utilized voter education and outreach jointly with local election officials. That's where the elections take place, whether it's a radio ad to educate voters on how to access their ballot, or now whether or not we can share more information about how our elections work and what's true and what's not true. I would work collaboratively with local election officials, not stand there by myself.
So the current Secretary of State has faced a lot of death threats. I mean, I've listened to the events where people allude to her getting hung, and she's asked for security details as a result. It occurs to me that you wouldn't be any more insulated from that as a Republican, because you also are out there saying, as she has, that our elections are fair and secure. Have you given thought to that, the way that that would impact you, your family, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I strongly oppose any sort of threats of violence, in person or digital or otherwise. So I was a county clerk. We did motor vehicles and license plates and collected taxes for DMV. So I'm pretty sure we've had a few threats. Not to minimize this, but to say, look, we need to bring back civility, and I think my candidacy will help do that. I think that being secure and protecting not only a Secretary of State, but our local election officials who are on the front lines couldn't be more important.
Pam Anderson, thank you for your time, and look forward to talking with you again.
Appreciate it. Thank you.